My name is Eugene Tulika. I'm a software engineer, certified Magento developer, and I will talk today about new presentation tier, and particularly how do we use data on presentation tier. And this is Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris O'Toole, also a developer at Magento, and I'm going to talk about the service IDL, interface definition language, and webhooks.
Okay, so let's get started. First of all, let's discuss what we are working on and what our goals, why we do that, why do we do the things which we do. So we are working on extensibility with two things in mind. We want to improve how Magento is upgradable, and we want to improve how different extensions which merchant may have is compatible to each other. So we want to solve the problem of communication between different extensions and relation of the extensions to Magento core. We want to build the new model of how do you write extensions so that it's easy to you to upgrade to new versions, even if you have a lot of extensions installed already. And it's easy to you to build your extension in that way that you don't need to make a lot of changes once Magento updated. And to enable you to install as many extensions as you want without risk of accidental conflicts, which I think most of you have seen in your life. So that's our goals. And now I'll talk a little bit more how do we approach the problems. So this is a simple picture how we can visualize the Magento application structure, both current and what we are working on. So Magento have the main tier, which represented particularly with models, helpers, and Magento has presentation tier, which is represented with layouts, templates, and all the files, which allows you to visualize the data. And the first new thing that you see in this picture is service. I guess nobody uses services right now in Magento 1.6, and this is something new that we want to introduce here. And service is a concept which will allow you to build application and build your presentation tier, which depends as less as possible on internal Magento implementation. Services itself encapsulates the logic of how different clients of the application access the data from the application and access the internal business operations that they want to involve to. And services is I think it's a well-known concept. How many of you knows about service layer? So you know about that, and it was introduced a while. And service concept itself is a thing in Magento which will be versioned, and it will have a well-described interface. That's how it's different from current Magento models and helpers, because models and helpers they can have PHP interface, but it's not versioned. You don't have a versions with that interface, and sometimes it's not described very well with some tools which can allow you to rely on that interface. Services, vice versa, is a concept in Magento which will allow you to build your presentation tier based on assumptions on the data that you want to get from the service, and that assumptions came from interface of the service. Moreover, service allows you to access the data and access the functionality of application in common ways through any client that you want to enable. Either it is internal client, like presentation tier. Presentation tier is a client which we assume it's sit inside the Magento, and actually it can invoke the same operations on models. But if it goes through the service, it will be in the same way like if it's external client, which will go through some SOAP API or REST API. So all the requests, all the operations will be done in common manner, regardless of kind of clients that you want to enable. And this keeps a little bit easier how do you operate with your implementation of your application, because now you need just to keep interface of the service the same. All other logic can change as much as you want, but interface of the service described with IDL, which Chris will talk a little bit more later. This interface will stay the same, And once you need to change that interface, you have different versions of that interface. So it allows you to change your internal implementation of the Magento framework and Magento system, more or less isolated from the extensions which is built on top of the service layer. So to repeat myself a little bit, all clients will go through the services. It means that when we go back to templates, templates will not have possibility to do any requests directly to the model. They will do requests to the services, and services will provide the data back to templates. Now let's go to the templates. The main difference now with the main concept which we want to introduce here is templating engine. So templating engine is a great concept which allows you to encapsulate all the logic and keep it as much simple as possible, and keep it, the logic which deals with presentation tier isolated from the logic which do business operations for your application. So templates has a well-defined syntax which is supposed to isolate your application, your presentation tier from business operations. And we, as a template engine, we choose Twig because Twig is very popular in community, in PHP community. I think a lot of PHP developers already familiar with that, but if they are not, it's easy to learn because it has very laconic syntax, but the syntax as powerful as needed for Magento needs. The other reason, Twig allows to build your own extensions. If you need to add some logic to the Twig, it will be possible to do through the extension to the Twig. So next, my next slide about how do we use Twig and Magento. So the main difference on how do we use templates, particular Twig template, in comparison to previous PHTML templates, is that the template becomes populated with the data. It doesn't do any request to any logic to get the data. From now, template will get the data which it needs to render beforehand. In this way, all data that you, in that way, you can again isolate the templating layer from the ways how do you get the data. Some other instance will take care of you and will take care of the template to provide the data, so that it enables to reuse the same template, for example, for different sources of the data without changing almost anything in implementation of the data. And here is an example how did we use it in Magento. So you can see there the references to the product entity. Product entity is an array which represents the data about the product. And I want to mention here that it is array, it's not an object, so we cannot invoke any method on it. And this is again back to my previous notice. It's done to isolate the different levels so that a template, even if it wants to, will not be able to get the data itself. And that will enable to concentrate when you develop your extension, and particularly when you develop your user experience, it will allow you to concentrate on this, on just representing the data, not the way how do you get it. And also interesting point is the very last strings there is custom Magento functionality, which allows you to render child block, and get the HTML from it. So this functionality comes from Magento-specific Twig extension, which we also built, and this is an example of the way how we can enlarge the Twig framework itself in order to support some Magento-specific functionality. So we talk about templates and services, and I've said that the template will not get data itself. So now I want to introduce the concept which allows Magento to provide the data to the templates. So to do that, we have used the configurable mechanism, which allows to build the particular service call, so to build particular service, particular method of the service to the template. And in this way, you don't need to care about, don't need to care yourself about about the ways how you want to grab the data. So this mechanism is introduced in layout, and you're able to use layout.xml file to describe what particular service you want to build to particular templates that you are using. And we call that service calls. Now I want to show how it's implemented. So the first example is how do we define service calls. It is defined in separate file in service call.xml for now, and it defines the parameters which describes the particular service call. It defines the service class which we are using, the method which we want to invoke, the arguments that we pass to this method, and moreover, it defines the name of the service call, which later we will see we will reference in our layout file. Now, the first example is how do we use service call. So this is a part of layout file which describes a new block, and you see the data service call. So this is the place. And here you see the name of the service call which we created in the previous step, and alias. Alias is the name of variable which will be available inside the Twig template in order to render the data which came from the service call. And at the end, so the next example is how do we actually render this data. So again, the product, which is an alias of the service call, contains the array of the data from the product. And the other one, the links, which is binned to the second service call, contains the data about the links. Few notes here. First of all, you see that there are defined two block types, and each of this block has own own service call. It means that the block structure doesn't affect the block hierarchy, doesn't affect the data shape that you will get. So you need to define own service call for each block, and in this way, each block becomes independent of its parent, or and in the same way, it becomes independent from its child. So you can move easily the different blocks on your layout structure, and it will not affect a lot how the data is represented later when your template gets rendered. And this is what we call blocks isolation. So your blocks definition becomes isolated from the sources of data, and it became isolated from the block implementation itself. The next example is an example of dynamic usage of the service calls. So it shows you how you can use the data from the service call just in your layout. So with invocation of the method on the block, you can bind the data from the service call to some other block which you want to populate with this data. And it's done in layout. And it allows you to eliminate such things like, for example, when you in prepare layout, setting some data to head block. So no, you now don't need to do that. You can do that via layouts. And now I want to concentrate on blocks itself. Blocks become a really generic thing because you just need just one type of the block in order to call templating engine and in order to render your data. So if previously you had to develop your own block in order to bind the data from models and helpers to the presentation tier, now we have the concept of the services. So for most cases, you just don't need to use the block for that. And you just need one particular type of the block, which will allow you to call the templating engine and to invoke the render mechanism on that. And as I already said, each block has own set of the data. So if you want to configure it with the data, it will you do need to do that for each block in your hierarchy. The service calls doesn't inherit even if hierarchy is structured like even if hierarchy has parent-child relationship. And layout elements also, as I said, can be easily replaced. And also, the interesting thing about this is that you can change the service call, but have the same template which renders the service. The only thing you should care is an alias, which binds the variable to your template. So it allows you to easily switch between different services, but have a representation tier built the same. And the last thing about presentation tier is configurable dropdown options. It's the concept from system configuration when you are able to define element like dropdown, and you are able to bind the source model to that. It's how it was done in Magento 1.x, but having service calls, you can achieve the same level of functionality with service call. You can take the data from service call and to build it to dropdown and render it in kind of dropdown when you need to do that in system configuration. So that now you have two ways to do that, and we created this additional approach in order to align all the data access scenarios, so all of the data access scenarios go through the service. The other few features that you will get in addition is ability to define some static configuration, some static drop-down options via configuration, and to define some more or less static drop-down options via constants. So you are able to reference the constants from system configuration. So I think that's it about presentation tier. Now I'm passing control to Chris. He will talk about webhooks. Thank you.
Yep. So you remember Eugene talked about services. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the service interface definition language, and that will kind of describe what is the input and the output of that service. And again, services are a great way to sort of encapsulate the business logic and create clear entry points into that logic. So the IDL for the services is a combination of XML schema and annotations within the PHP code. So here at the bottom, you can see an example of the annotations. In this case, we have a shipping rate service. And you can see we have a consumes and a produces tag. Yes, thank you. So the consumes tag, you can see there's an XML schema file that's referenced and an element within that file that will describe the input for this function. And the produces, similar, defines what the output of this function is, what the expected output is. And then the function itself will take an associative array in PHP, and that provides more flexibility on the type of input that can be provided so that it can expand over time. So here's an example of that input schema. We can see the carrier configuration and the rate request. And so if you're familiar with the way the PHP, the shipping rates code works in Magento, you're probably familiar with this second element there with the rate request. So that would have all the data that you're used to having about the cart so that you can give a proper response for the shipping rate. But we've also added the config so that we can allow for these services to be a remote service and not have to request extra data, so it's less chatty, requesting like the configuration. So this would be the configuration for the module that's trying to implement this service. And then here's an example output schema. And again, if you're familiar with the shipping rates code, it should be very similar. It's just sort of formalizing that description of the data that's returned. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about webhooks. So I'm sure everyone's here is familiar with the observer and the events that are in Magento right now. So you can subscribe to a topic, and then you'll receive an object, and you can turn that object and sort of make changes to it. So webhooks are another way of pushing events out, but to an HTTP endpoint. So why might that be interesting? So like if you wanted to do a fulfillment service, then you might want to register for an event like an order being ready to be shipped, right? And with webhooks, you won't have to pull Magento through their web API, or write your own observer and then push events to your own service on your own endpoint. So this will help save time and development effort. And the events that we push out from Magento are asynchronous, because again, the difference between webhooks and the observer model that's already in Magento is that you cannot respond with some data. If you do, Magento will ignore that, because the intent is really just to notify you of something. And if you need to make changes, you would use the web API to call back into Magento. So here we have a sample config file. And in there, you can see tags like endpoint URL. So that's where you would define what is your endpoint out on the web. Where should we send this data? Where are we pushing it to? So we recommend you use HTTPS for that, so that we can be sure that we're sending it to you. And then that data will be sent with an HMAC signature, so that you can be sure it came from the correct Magento instance. And we'll also have a header that lets you know what the domain was for that Magento instance, so that you can use the same endpoint for multiple Magento merchants. And then there's a section there for topics. So with a Magento observer, right, there's Magento has its own topics that you can listen to. And we're sort of creating a separate set of topics where we listen to those topics and then sort of try and create more refined versions of those topics. So instead of having a save before and a save after event, you can have like a new product created event. So in this case, we have customer created, right, and customer updated, and customer deleted. So you kind of know exactly what's going on. And it's very extensible, so you can write your own topics and then use them, and they can be reused by the community. So here's a sample configurator or sample listener. So at the top there, we're taking the JSON data that gets pushed out. So I guess I forgot to mention the data that we're pushing out over the webhooks to your endpoint is a JSON version of what you saw in the service IDL. So that will take that JSON data, convert it into an associated array for this sample PHP listener. And then in the second section there, you can see we're sort of setting up, we're reading what is the topic from the header so we can make our decision. Because again, you can reuse the endpoint for multiple topics and events. And then we have this app finish. So this is a sample Solix application. And so what that will do is call this function once we've finished and returned our 200 OK. So at the bottom there, we have the return empty string. And so that's, again, because webhooks are asynchronous. And that's done in our implementation on Magento by spawning off a cron job. We'll send that out for you so that it won't affect whatever processing was going on that sort of triggered that event. So there's no, since there's no data that you can return, there's no point in holding up that request that was sent to you that's pushing the data. So you should just try and return a 200 OK. As soon as you may want to add it to a message queue and then return that so that you have persisted this data and then process it later. So in this example, I'm just calling a function after the 200 OK has been returned. And in this example, I would just post an order was created to Twitter, which you can imagine for fulfillment example that you have this, that an order is ready to be shipped. So then you can go do your processing on your end and then call Magento back on the web APIs that exist. So here's just an example of parsing that data once it's been converted from JSON into the PHP array. It's pretty straightforward. And again, it allows for flexibility in your code and in the evolution of the services. So again, one of the nice things about having the code on your server is you can update it without having merchants have to deal with installing something new and being worried. So once we had this webhooks, we thought, well, what if we made the calls synchronous? What could we do then instead of having just asynchronous calls? Okay, we do a lot of things there, but it might get messy if we allow that for anything, right? So there are certain points in the Magento code where it kind of makes sense. There's like a logic point where you might want to make an interesting decision or gather some interesting data. So an example might be for, again, the shipping rates. You want to gather shipping rates so that you can display them to a customer on the checkout screen. So this is where the callback would come in. And the idea is we can make a synchronous request to your endpoint. And much like the service IDL, you know what the input will be and what your expected response is, what Magento expects back from this request. So we post to you synchronously, and you do your processing, and as quickly as possible, return the results from your processing. And then Magento can consume those results and display them to the user or process them further. So here's an example of how you do that configuration. So we have a config XML snippet here for a carrier. So you notice there's, instead of a model tag, we have a service tag here. And so we have a service callback service that has already been implemented in Magento and is up on GitHub for you to check out. And it implements the IDL that I was kind of showing you some snippets of earlier. And when Magento goes through the flow of trying to check a customer out, if this shipping module is enabled, it will make a call out to the service, and the service will go and post to your endpoint. Now, how does it figure out where your endpoint is? So if you look, there's also a subscriber tag, and there's just a string there. So this subscriber tag goes to another section of config XML, where you can register your subscriber, which, if you remember from Webhooks, it looks very similar, right? It has an endpoint URL, and so that's how we know where to post this callback, this request for rates for shipping. And then you will respond based on what the service IDL expects. And again, this will be in JSON with the current implementation. And right now we have some topics here. And so this is like a callback topic as opposed to a webhook event topic. And we're looking for feedback on that as well. Does this make sense to you? Or does it seem like it's too much? So take some time to think about it and let us know, please. All right, and the input was defined in the IDL, like I've been saying. But here, okay, here's another sample application that would return, listen to the post, which has the configuration and the cart information for a rates request. Again, very similar to a traditional extension that you would write in PHP for shipping rates. But notice at the top, again, we're decoding the JSON, but we don't have the finish call because we're not doing this asynchronously. We're trying to we need to respond synchronously. So, and this is a very simple example. It just kind of looks at what was the weight of all the items in the cart and just spits that back as the price for this rate request. Then Magento will take that data and with the service callback that we've written for you, and feed that back into the Magento shipping code, which will be unaware that this was called out to a remote endpoint versus local PHP code. But here's an example of that response that we send in JSON encoding. And once Magento is finished processing that, it will show up to the customer, again, unaware that it was calling remote code that could be written in PHP or any other language because it's hosted on your servers. So please give us feedback now. Also, the code is on GitHub. We pushed it on Monday, so please check that out and give us more feedback once you've played with it.
One more notice to that, the code on GitHub is dealing mainly with catalog module and particularly product view page. So all the concept that we introduced was for this page, like presentation tier changes in Twig, plus services. And also regarding webhooks is a different module with each webhooks module. Also, please check that. And regarding callbacks, what is that? It's also webhooks module.